We are continuing in this series on pain, painful emotions. And what I tried to make clear in the first night is that pain was designed to be a very good, useful tool that every time we stepped outside of what was healthy, we had experienced pain. And that was to motivate us to get back into healthy, and then we'd resolve the problem and the pain would go away. And last week we talked about guilt. And guilt has the very same purpose. We have this little thing called a conscience, which is our internal security guard. And whenever we're doing something outside of love, something that's not right, like lying or cheating or stealing, our conscience gives us pain. And it basically says, I'm going to keep screaming at you until you change your behavior, and then this pain will go away. So it was designed, again, to be a very good thing, but it was designed to be resolved. And once it's resolved, it goes back away, and we're back to a place of contentment, happiness, joy, peace, serenity, all of those words. What we looked at is that complex trauma takes two very good systems, pain and conscience, and it provides an environment for a child where they can't resolve them. They try, but they don't make any difference because mom and dad aren't changing anything. So the pain doesn't go away. They're told they're the problem, so the guilt doesn't go away. And so that puts the child in a complex trauma family in a difficult position. Nobody wants to live with pain and a conscience that's bugging you constantly and you can't fix it. It will not be resolved. So children respond in a bunch of different ways. They can go to trying to be perfect, and they beat themselves up every time they do the littlest thing wrong in order to try to make the pain go away by never doing anything wrong. And most of you have gone that route. Some of you are still doing that. And then for other kids, they just go, I got to numb my conscience. I got to freeze my conscience, and that sets you up for addiction. Drugs, alcohol, food, distractions, anything that numbs the conscience. And so unresolved guilt and pain within complex trauma sets a child up to try and solve it with solutions that work only for a little while, but they make things worse down the road. And so that is the dilemma. And we've been trying to rethink pain and conscience so that you can begin to understand their purpose and learn how to resolve them in a healthy way. Now, in case some of you are saying, I'm still not convinced I need to work on my conscience. I think this conscience thing is just a pain, and I don't see why I have to deal with guilt in my life. So I want to give you two things, hopefully, that will be helpful for you to think that through, okay? I don't know if you realize, but people are very sensitive. They have a kind of a radar to people who have a lot of guilt. And if they sense that you have a lot of guilt, they go, I just found the way to manipulate that person. So every time they don't do what I want them to, I will lay a guilt trip on them, and they'll feel so guilty because they got so much guilt, they'll do whatever I want. And that can just make you a prisoner to your mother-in-law, to your nosy neighbor, whatever. But if you don't deal with guilt, you create the environment where people can easily manipulate you. And that includes your children. And children know that you've probably got a lot of guilt around stuff you've done with them, and they will manipulate you to give them what they want. And that's not good parenting. There's a second part, and it has to do with the parenting, and it's called guilt-based parenting. I think so many parents coming out of addiction into recovery, their greatest area of guilt is what they've done to their kids. And they look at their kids and they see some of the damage already. They see their kids acting out, their kids in pain. And they just feel so terrible that they go in their mind, do I want to compensate for that? And what that means is I want to overcompensate for my guilt. So I'll give them whatever they want. I'll let them away with stuff. I won't set firm boundaries for them because I feel so bad for all that I put them through. So now you end up spoiling your kids. Do you realize who you're really trying to fix is your own guilt? You're not doing what's best for your children. You're doing what's best for your guilt. And you're actually hurting your children. So those are just two other reasons why this guilt and dealing with guilt is so important. Now, what I want to focus on tonight is this. Most people that I work with that come out of complex trauma and addiction don't just have guilt for all the bad stuff they've done. They have what we call false guilt. And that is when they were made to feel guilty when they didn't even do anything wrong. And what I want to do is kind of come at this tonight from a little different angle. And my guess would be that most of you have struggles with false guilt. And so it's an important part for most people in recovery to develop tools for sorting out false guilt from true guilt, for dealing with false guilt so they can get rid of it. And so I want to come at it from an angle that I hope just gives you some extra insight into this. I want you to think about your conscience, and there's 4 different types of conscience. And you'll quickly get the hang of what I'm talking about. So number 1, every addict knows about it. It's called a numb conscience. So think of it this way. You're out cheating on your partner and your conscience is bothering you, but you don't want to stop cheating. You're kind of enjoying it. So you go, I got a dilemma. I got my conscience bugging me, but I don't want to change my behavior. So I change my behavior or I shut up my conscience. So let's just drink, get high, let's numb our conscience. And so that we've all done. We know we're doing something we shouldn't be, but we don't want to change, so we find a way to shut up our conscience. So drug and alcohol are fantastic for that, but you don't have to have just drugs and alcohol. You can just be busy with distractions, so you never take time to think. You just go, go, go. You can do kind of the more acceptable addictions, food, exercise, sex, whatever, but they're all designed to numb the conscience. So that's number 1. Number 2 is what we would call a seared or a calloused conscience. So a seared or callous. So callous, I don't know if you've ever been shoveling or raking at this time of year, and you rake all day and you get a great big blister. But you can't stop because you got half the yard done, you got the other half to go. So you keep raking, and what you find is skin begins to build on that area, and it creates a callus. And a callus it deadens the pain. It is so thick you don't feel the pain anymore. And then if you were searing something, I don't know if you ever touched a hot stove. I did it once, never again. Or an iron or stuff like that. But it deadens the nerves so you don't feel if you do it enough times. And so what we can do with our conscience is we kind of just build calluses on it. We stuff it down, harden our heart, and pretty soon we don't even realize we got a conscience. There's just nothing there. It is so dead, we have no remorse. Many people coming out of a lot of trauma have that. And they've got so much pain that they can't resolve, that they just have to deaden their heart. They got to shut it down. And so they will just do things to make it so they don't feel any remorse at all. Then they can lie to people, it doesn't bother them. Hurt people, doesn't bother them. And if you go to a psychopath, that is the epitome of a hardened conscience. They have zero remorse even if they kill somebody. But that is a person coming out of extreme pain, and the brain is trying to survive, and it can't resolve it, so it just hardens it. It calluses it. It makes it dead. And you want to know what scares me about our culture today? All the psychiatrists, psychologists are telling us that we have a generation of children coming up right now that don't have a conscience. And that is a scary thing to think of where we're going to be in 20 years from now. Because if you let children who already have hardened that and shut it down, and you let them out on the world as adults, it could be a very scary thing. So let me go to the third one, and that's the one I want to focus on, which is a poorly trained conscience, which I call false guilt. And again, it's, in case you haven't understood the definition yet, is when you are made to feel that you are at fault when you haven't done anything wrong. And so you walk around feeling guilty, but you didn't do anything wrong. And that's really difficult because you can't resolve it, because you didn't do anything wrong. So you just carry all of this guilt. So I want to give you 5 different causes of a mistrained conscience or false guilt. So number 1, if you had parents who blamed you for stuff and told you it was your fault. So I'll give you an example. Dad is very angry, and he says, "You're making me angry. You are responsible for my anger." And you believe it. And so what happens with a parent who's lying to you? Dad has anger issues because Dad's got anger issues. He's got his problems. He's not owning it. He's trying to make you feel you are the cause of his choice to get angry. And so you believe it. You're a child. And so you walk around and you say, every time Dad gets angry, I did something wrong. It's my fault. Or if Mom is sad and she goes, I'm sad because you kids are so hard to deal with. You're so demanding. And every time Mom's sad, you go, I did something wrong. That's a mistrained conscience by an authority figure telling you a lie. But you believe it. So then you go around with all your friends. And if they're angry or they're sad, then you go, I must have did something wrong. And then if your friends mess up, you go, maybe I should have helped them. Maybe if I was there for them, they wouldn't have messed up. And now you're feeling guilty for their decisions. Because Mom and Dad trained you that you were responsible for the other person's decisions. Some of you grew up in homes where your parents were very poor. And they reminded you that if they never had you, they'd have a lot more money around. And so now you felt guilty all the time whenever they could hardly pay the bills because you were using up all the money. Or you might have grown up where when you wanted a hug, you were told you were being selfish. When you wanted Dad to play with you, you were told you were being selfish. Very basic needs every child has. And you express those needs, and you were told you were being selfish for having those needs, and you believed it. And so now you believe it is wrong to stand up for yourself. It is wrong to express a need and that you're being selfish if you do so. So parents can do that. The second one is tied into it. Some of you were given the responsibility as a child to take care of your siblings. You're told you're the oldest. I want you to make sure your kids get fed. I want you to babysit because we're going out. And you were given this responsibility. Now, some of that was good. Some of that was healthy. But sometimes your parents gave you more responsibility than they should. And so you began to feel that if anything happened to your siblings, you did something wrong because you were responsible for them. And if you saw Dad angry and you couldn't make them feel better, you felt responsible for that. All of those different things. Then I can go into your life today. If somebody commits suicide, many of you go immediately to guilt. I probably should have done more. If I'd only been there, if I only picked up on the clues, I would have stopped this. And you take on guilt because you have a sense of responsibility that is bigger than it should be. And you make yourself responsible for the decisions of other people. Now let me give you an example. Let's say people around you in recovery have very legitimate needs. But you're a limited human being and you got children, you got a job, you got your own stuff you're trying to take care of. And one of your friends comes and says, I really have this need, could you help me? And you go, I can't right now because I promised to spend the night with my kids. If some of you refuse their request for help, knowing they had a legitimate need, you'd feel guilty the rest of the night. But that's taking on a responsibility that isn't even yours. But you're trained to do that. Some of you, if somebody started asking you for a cigarette every time they saw you, or a ride, and you finally set a boundary and say, no more rides, you'd feel guilty for the next week that you set a boundary. So what I want you to understand, that's a mistrained conscience. That is a conscience that has been made to feel responsible for others more than you should be. So part of recovery is figuring that out. Okay, there's a third thing, and that's yourself, where you set unrealistic standards for yourself. So let me give you an example. Some of you, like I said, feel that you shouldn't have any needs. You should just serve everybody, and if you have a need, then you're bad. And you get all down on yourself because you had a need. And then part of that is I should never ask for help. If I ask for help, I am being too needy, I am being a burden, and then you feel guilty for asking for help. That's part of that unrealistic expectation. Some of you think you should do recovery perfectly, that you should never make a mistake, that you should never disappoint anybody, that you should never have a bad day. And if you do, you get down on yourself. That's a mistrained conscience by your own expectations. I always find it interesting watching clients at React, because some, if they start to cry, they immediately feel guilty. Because now they're putting others out. They're being an inconvenience. And that makes them feel guilty. Some of you feel that if you're a good friend or a good partner or a good child, you should read Dad's mind, you should read your partner's mind, you should know what they need before they even ask. And if they have to ask you something, you get down on yourself because you should have known. Some of you grew up where if you didn't learn something in 1 minute flat, you got told you were stupid, and you got punished for that. And so now you walk around feeling like you're a slow learner and stupid. And if you don't learn how to do something today really fast, you get really down on yourself. And you beat yourself up. I've had clients who feel guilty that they're alive. I've had clients whose dad told them, your mom wishes she never had you because you are so difficult. I've had other clients where dad said, Mom died in childbirth, you killed your mom, and they've carried that guilt. And so their very existence, they beat themselves up for. I've had other clients that their dad said, I wish you were a boy, but you're a girl. And they felt guilty all their life for being a girl. because they had that expectation. Some of you, because of the abuse, the neglect, all of those things you experience, your brain interpreted it by saying, it's my fault. I got abused, I got neglected, I got abandoned because I did something wrong. And you still carry that guilt today and beat yourself up for all of those things that happened to you. And that is a massive thing. One of the things that I look for when it comes to these unrealistic expectations is people with unrealistic expectations walk around and say, I should have known. I should have done that. I should. And sometimes I say, quit saying should. Let's just take you where you're at, not where you think you should be. Because as long as you're focusing on where you think you should be, you're beating yourself up for where you're at. And that's not good for you. But that's what some of you do. Number 4. Most of you, without even realizing it, growing up with guilt that's unresolved, you thought you numbed your conscience, you thought you blocked all of that out, but that guilt was still down there. And what you don't realize is that it became your emotional default setting. So if you were to stop doing whatever you're doing and get really quiet and get in touch with where you were emotionally right now, many of you would end up feeling guilty. And that's just kind of where your guilt meter was trained to always be on. And it's always there. Now, why I tell you that is this. If you have a default setting of guilt, then you have a problem. Because now your brain says, if I got to keep this guilt monster alive, I got to feed it. Well, how do I feed it? Well, I got to find fault with everything I do. I got to keep setting the bar so high that I never meet it, and that keeps me feeling guilt, which feeds the monster. So without even realizing it, your brain sets up a system subconsciously to feed the guilt monster. And so you've got systems in your brain that are always looking and finding stuff that you are doing wrong. And you don't even have to look hard. You can just manufacture stuff that you think you're doing wrong. Now, here's how good it is. Let's say right now you stop and you go, I don't think I'm feeling guilty. Guess what just happened in your brain? I must be doing something wrong. I'm not feeling guilty. So you feel guilty for not feeling guilty. See, you just fed the guilt monster. And some of you have done that all your life. And then part of that, so guilt is your default setting. What goes with that is hard on yourself is a default setting. And when you look at the characteristics of complex trauma, false guilt, hard on yourself. And that is such a big issue. Okay, final one. Not all of you will relate to this, but it's an important one for those who do relate. You're going to get within churches, within other groups, support groups, recovery groups. You're going to have people who walk around and set a standard for what a spiritual person would be like or a really healthy person would be like, and it's going to be a whole lot of rules. So let's say you go into a church and the pastor there, he's a bit of a stiff, nose in the air kind of guy, and he's against piercings and tattoos and long hair and all of that. And you walk in the door with all your piercings and tattoos, and he looks at you and immediately know you're judged. Now, if you were wanting to fit into that church and you thought they were right and they represented God, you would go into that church and you go, oh, I am living so wrong. Let's get rid of all of this stuff. I'm a terrible person. And you would feel loads of guilt. And I get it from people within the recovery world where they get a sponsor and they say, because you're doing this or that, and they're not doing anything wrong, but they're wrong in the sponsor's mind, they get judged and told they're doing a terrible job. So what you have in all of those 5 situations is somebody in a position of authority is misrepresenting healthy. And they are making you feel bad for what you're doing in your journey. And it is creating false guilt. You can't resolve it because you're not doing anything wrong, but you're feeling it and it's not going to go away. I hope you realize that for most people in recovery, false guilt is often a bigger issue than true guilt. False guilt can mess you up and send you to a relapse, especially if you go to the beat yourself up stuff. You can beat yourself down so much that you go, what's the point? I can't do this. I'm not cut out for it. And you relapse. So how do we begin to deal with this stuff? So that's number 4. We got to retrain our conscience. Now that's easier said than done. But what I want you to understand and see is this is a big part of recovery. That you have to retrain your conscience. Because if you don't, you're going to still be feeling lots of guilt that you shouldn't be. You're going to be beating yourself up and basically leading yourself to self-destructive behaviors. So you have to retrain it. And what that means is this. Every time you feel guilty, you stop and you go, is that true guilt or false guilt? Did I really do something wrong? Or is this my old mixed up conscience talking? So you do that every time you feel guilt. Now, usually in the beginning, you're going to need somebody to help you process that. Because you're not going to be able to figure it out on your own. But let's say you go, I think that's my mistrained conscience talking, that's false guilt. And then you decide to put a piercing back in, and then you immediately feel guilty. And then here's what happens. Your brain says, I feel guilty, I must be guilty. But what you have to do is say, shut up. There's nothing wrong with a piercing. I'm going to walk through this even though I feel guilty because I know in my cerebral cortex that my limbic system, false guilt, is lying to me. And you go through it and pretty soon it doesn't hurt anymore. You retrain your conscience. But in the beginning, get ready for your conscience yipping at you a lot. Because it's going to say, you're bad, and you say, no, I'm not. I know what I'm doing is right, and you walk through it. Now, hopefully you see the next thing. You're going to need an accurate standard of what is healthy and what is not healthy. You realize I was given a mixed up standard. Some healthy, some unhealthy. Now I have to figure out what's healthy, what's not healthy, what I had a conscience about that I shouldn't. So what is a standard for health? What is it that I want to be the new trainer of my conscience? And that's going to be your journey in figuring that out. But I hope you see it's an important one. And you probably are going to need somebody again that has some wisdom that you see as a good life that you can go to for help in figuring that out. Now, there's one other thing that I want you to be aware of. This journey of retraining your conscience, do you realize that it's going to get tiring? Like every time, 50 times a day, you go, okay, did I do it right or wrong? Is this my true conscience or is this my false guilt? And you go, oh, screw it. It can get exhausting. So don't beat yourself up that you don't figure it all out in a week. And just learn to kind of pace yourself and figure out one thing at a time. I don't know anybody in life who hasn't gone through some retraining of their conscience, because we all get mistrained consciences through our upbringing. But I do think those coming out of complex trauma and spiritual abuse have the greatest difficulty because it's such a screwed up conscience. It's been so mistrained, it is mind-boggling when they try to sort it out. But it is an important part of the journey. And I hope you'll be able to kind of see a bit of a roadmap moving forward of what you need to begin to do to sort this stuff out. Because if you don't, it's usually trouble. Well, I thought with this guilt thing, I'd tell you another story that has to do with guilt. And I want you just kind of think in terms of, if you were to think of your greatest failure, the thing that caused you the greatest amount of guilt. I imagine in your mind you can go there quite quickly. And some people that, when they do that, they go, I don't think maybe God could forgive me for that. I think God could forgive me for a lot of things, but I'm not sure God can forgive me for that. So I want to tell you this story from the life of a guy named Peter. And if you're not familiar with the Bible, Peter was one of the 12 men that Jesus picked to train. And he's become affectionately known as the disciple with the foot-shaped mouth. And what it meant was he's always sticking his foot in his mouth. And when he took one foot out, he just put the other one in. He kind of was the self-appointed spokesperson. So you find him talking more than anybody else. And he was always pushing his way to the top. Always wanted to be the leader, always wanted to be the best. So let me just tell you about this guy. Because he became, after Jesus died and went back to heaven, Peter became one of the main leaders in the spread of the message that Jesus left. So he went from being this guy that was super messed up, and you're going to see kind of some of his failure, to being this very reliable, wonderful leader. So Peter he spent time with Jesus, and out of the 12 men, Jesus picked 3 of the guys to really kind of give special training to. And Peter was one of the guys picked. So if you're Peter, you can just imagine you feel special. You can feel kind of like your head's getting a little big. And then Peter's name was Cephas. And Cephas means a pebble. And one day Jesus said, I'm changing your name from a pebble to Peter, which means a boulder. So you're going, wow, Jesus thinks I'm a rock. Wow, he really likes me. And you're getting a big head. And then Jesus gave him some leadership jobs. He did have some ability. And he was developing that. And so he was getting more responsibilities. And then one day Jesus said, Peter, on this rock, I'm going to build my church. And he was talking to Peter about something Peter said. And Peter's saying, wow, Jesus is going to use me in a big way. He's going to use me to build this church thing. Wow, I feel special. I feel really important. And so all of this stuff has been going on in Peter's life. And then just a couple days before Jesus died, and Jesus had told the disciples that he was going to die, and they didn't believe it. They ignored it. And then one day Jesus got a little donkey, and he rode into the city on this donkey. And there was a verse back in the Jewish Bible, which is our Old Testament, that said that when Messiah comes, and the Messiah was the king, the promised king that would rule the world. And so the Jews looked forward to this promised Messiah, and it said when he came, he would ride into the city of Jerusalem on a donkey, a baby donkey. And so Jesus did that. And Peter is going, wow, Jesus is about to take over the world. He's about to become the king in Jerusalem and spread out over all the world. and I'm one of the top 3, I bet you I'm going to get one of the top jobs in running the world. So Peter is walking around feeling like he's pretty hot stuff. And his head is really big. But what has happened also in this is he has fallen in love with Jesus. He respects him. He wants to give his life to serve with Jesus, to be involved in what Jesus is doing. And so his heart is full of love and commitment to this Jesus person. And so the night before Jesus dies, and the disciples haven't quite twigged in yet that he's going to die, Jesus says this: all of you guys are going to run away. I'm going to get arrested tonight, and you're all going to take off. And Peter goes, all the other 11 might run away. Not me. My love is stronger than everybody else's. My love is so committed, nothing would break my love. And he says that with some passion. And Jesus turns and he says, Peter, before the rooster crows 3 times tomorrow morning, you're going to deny that you even know me on 3 occasions. Imagine what that did to Peter. He's going, I would never deny you. That's the dumbest warning I've ever heard. You don't know how great my love for you is, how committed I am to you is. So they have a supper together, the Passover, and then Jesus takes them and they go down over to a garden that was very quiet where they spent a lot of time. And it's late, it's midnight, and Jesus says to the 3 guys, Peter, James, and John, he says, come over with me. I need to pray. My heart is so heavy. It's breaking. Please come and support me while I pray and talk to my Father. And so they go with him off by himself, and they promptly fall asleep. And Jesus prays, and he comes back and he wakes them up, and he says, come on, guys, I need your support. Please stay awake and be there for me. And he goes and prays again. They fall back asleep. And then Jesus comes back and he says, you know what, guys? And he says this, I think, to Peter, the spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak. You relate to that? You know what you should do and want to do? It's just getting your body to cooperate. And so he says, you guys, it's time to go. And they weren't there for him, and I bet you Peter just felt, what's going on here? I'm supposed to be there for him. And then soldiers come rushing into the garden, and they arrest Jesus. And Peter, he's going to prove his loyalty to Jesus. And so you have to understand, there's about 1,000 soldiers coming into the garden. And so they're thinking Jesus is going to run away, which is the dumbest idea, so they're ready for anything. So Peter says, I'm going to prove my loyalty to Jesus. So he takes out a sword that he had, and he starts hacking it. 1,000 soldiers, really, Peter? And he swings it, and he cuts a guy's ear off. Now, I don't think he was aiming for his ear. I think he's aiming for his neck. But he got his ear, and Jesus stops him and says, Peter, put your sword away. Fixes the guy's ear up. And then Jesus says, you know what, soldiers, take me, but let these other guys go. So Jesus is wanting to protect them, because he knows if they're identified with him, they could get killed as well. So we're told all of the disciples took off, just like Jesus said they would. But Peter, he says, I'm not going to totally take off. I'm just going to sneak around behind bushes and follow where they take Jesus. So he follows from a distance, but he's not right up there anymore. And they take Jesus up into the official court building. So outside the official court building was this fenced-in area where the soldiers were. After they delivered Jesus, they went there, and there was fires built, and they got warmed up. It was a cold night. So Peter says, I'm going to sneak in, and I'll go around the fire, and I'll just wait and see what happens to Jesus. So he sneaks in, And he goes and he's warming his hand up around the fire. And a little girl comes up to him that was at the gate. And she says, I saw you with him earlier. You're with that Jesus guy. Peter said, I don't know who you're talking about. I don't know any Jesus. He denies that he knows him once. Then there's a soldier standing there. He says, yeah, I saw you in the garden with him. Peter says, you got the wrong guy. I wasn't in any garden. I don't know any Jesus. Did it twice. And a third person says, yeah, I can tell by your accent. You're not from around here. You're from up where Jesus is from. You're got to be with Jesus. And Peter says, I swear on my God. So he takes a vow. I do not know Jesus. And he storms out. But before he does, you want to know what happens? It was just at that moment they were moving Jesus from one courtroom to another. And Jesus is walking along kind of an outdoor sidewalk, elevated, and he looks down to where Peter is, and Peter looks up and they make eye contact. And Peter remembered what Jesus said. And then the rooster crowed 3 times. So what we're told is that Peter was so broken, he went out and he wept bitterly. He just had a meltdown. This was the greatest failure he could ever imagine. One day earlier, he thought he was the strongest, most loyal, most devoted follower of Jesus in the world. And now he had just denied that he even known him, and he took a solemn oath that he didn't know Jesus. He had done the greatest act of failure. He denied Jesus. And he cries, and his heart is broken. So Jesus dies. He rises again. One day, Peter says to all the other disciples, you know what, I'm bored. Let's go fishing, because they all used to be fishermen. So they go out and they start fishing. And while they're fishing, they notice somebody walking along the beach. They don't recognize who it is. And the person builds a little fire, gets out a little frying pan, and starts cooking some stuff. And then he goes, hey, you guys, you caught anything? And they go, nope. He says, throw your net on the other side of the boat. It's like, well, who's this guy think he is? So they say, okay, throw that. And all of a sudden, their net's full of fish. It is so full, they can't even pull it in. And Peter goes, bingo, I know who that guy is. That's Jesus. And he takes his big robe off, and he jumps in the water, and he goes running to Jesus. And then I bet you he goes, uh-oh. I denied I know him. Now I got to look at him. And all of it's there. And now you got to watch what Jesus does. Notice I just told you he made a fire? Think that would remind Peter of a little fire he'd just been around lately? He recreates the scene. And then he asks Peter 3 times the same question. Think that would remind him of anything? Yes. So here's what he does. He says, Peter, do you love me? Now you have to understand there's 2 Greek words that are used for love here. One is agape, and that's perfect love. That is total, unconditional, God-type love. Second one is phileo, which is I like you. Okay? Both were love. So Jesus says to Peter, do you agape me? Do you love me with that perfect love you claimed you love me with? You know what Peter says? I like you. Says, I can't say any longer that I love you agape love, but I do like you. He's getting honest. And then Peter says again, Peter, do you agape me? And he says, I like you. And then Jesus asks the 3rd time, here's what he says, Peter, do you even like me? He switches to phileo. And do you want to know what Peter says? God, you know my heart. You know everything. You know I like you. So Jesus forgives Peter. He gets him to be honest. He gets him to own that he had a lot of pride. He had a lot of overconfidence. He was a lot weaker than he thought he was. He had failed miserably to what he promised to do. He gets him to own all of that. And then he says, Peter, go feed my sheep. Now, what would you have expected after such a failure? Peter, go in the doghouse for 10 years And if you behave, then maybe I'll let you help sort paper clips or something. But he says, go feed my sheep. So what I want you to understand here, that greatest failure turned into Peter's greatest growth. Here's what happened out of that. Never after that point in time did Peter walk around saying, I'm hot stuff. Never after that did he walk around saying, I can depend on my own love and commitment. After that, he said, God, I need you desperately. God, I am so weak that you put me in the right circumstances, I will fail. I need help, and I need to be depending moment by moment by moment. So that failure resulted in a surrender and a dependence on God that caused God to be able to say, now I can put you into a powerful position. Because now you got the humility to handle it. Now you got the dependence to lean on me for all of that. And now I can use you. Before, if I had used you, you just went around thinking it was all because of you. And you went around thinking you were the reason for your success. But I've allowed a failure so great so you'll never take credit again. And that turned into the greatest growth time for Peter. But there's a second thing. Peter now had a heart for people who failed. There was a guy that came along by the name of Mark. He was in the garden with Peter that night. Peter got out the sword, and then one of the soldiers grabbed Mark, who was just a young teenager, and Mark was so scared, he ran, and the guy pulled his robe off, and he ran home naked. That was his start in following Jesus, running home naked. And then Paul came along and said, I want to take this Mark guy and train him to be a leader. And he took Mark with him on a missionary journey. And Mark failed miserably. And Paul said, I'd never want to use that guy again. Do you want to know who came along? Peter. Peter says, Mark, come with me. And Mark trained under Peter. And you know what? We have a little book in the Bible now called Mark. Why do we have it? Because Peter tells his story through Mark. Peter took a failing young man who thought he had failed too badly, says, I've been there, it's not a big deal, learn from it, let's go. And he grew and he became effective. And then he became the greatest shepherd to all these people that were following Jesus. And Jesus said, feed my sheep, feed my sheep, feed my lambs. And that's what Peter did. And he went out and he reached even more people than Jesus reached in his ministry. You want to know what I love about Peter? At the end of his life, they arrested Peter and they said, we're going to crucify you. And he said, well, Jesus was crucified. I'm glad you count me worthy to die the same way he did. But he says, I want you to do this. I don't deserve to be crucified upside right. Crucify me upside down. Because I don't deserve to die in the exact same way as my master. So Peter was crucified upside down. So he learned humility right to the end of his life. All the success, all the fame that came out of his great ministry didn't go to his head. He said, crucify me upside down. So, failure, is it final? No. Peter shows us that. He says, you can have the worst failure if you surrender it all to God. He'll take it and turn it into great growth. And you'll someday thank Him for the humility and grace that it taught you.